Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey into forgotten history. Night, we uncover a family buried in silence. A family too evil for the history books in 1807 there. Crimes turned the Louisiana Bayou into a place of terror, asterisk. The Louisiana Bayou in 1807 was a place where time seemed to stand still, a land of shadowed cypress trees, rising from black water where the air hung heavy with heat and silence broken only by the cry of birds or the slow ripple of an alligator sliding through the swamp. It was a place both beautiful and haunting, and it drew men and women who wanted to disappear from the eyes of the world. The swamps could hide a fugitive or shelter. A family with secrets, and in those years when Louisiana was newly a part of the United States, the government's reach into those waters was weak, and uncertain lawmen feared the bayou because it belonged to no one and to everyone, and it swallowed evidence as easily as it swallowed sound. Among those who settled deep in the swamp, there was one family whispered about even then, a family that lived apart from all others, whose very name was carried on the lips of neighbors with fear and suspicion. They were not like other settlers who planted crops and prayed on Sundays. Their cabin was set apart on a ridge of dry ground, hidden by willows and palmetto, and travelers swore they heard strange sounds from that place at night, sounds that made them quicken their steps and look back over their shoulders as if eyes were following them. The bayou held many secrets, but this family would become the darkest of them. All it began with Jean and Marguerite, a couple who had drifted into Louisiana sometime after the territory changed hands. They claimed to be from Virginia, but no one ever saw proof of it, and some said their accents carried a hint of something foreign, a roughness that didn't fit. They bought no land, they signed no papers. They simply appeared one season, built a crude shack with the help of 2 grown sons, and declared the swamp their home. The locals tried to welcome them at first, but soon withdrew because the newcomers were cold and standoffish, refusing offers of food or help, keeping to themselves in a way that felt more hostile than private. John was a tall man with a hard face, scarred across one cheek from an old wound. He worked with his hands, but never spoke much, never laughed, never joined the other men in town. When he came to trade for supplies, he stared too long at people with eyes that seemed empty. Marguerite was no softer. She had a sharp tongue and a stare that made even the bravest look away. She was tall for a woman and carried herself like a soldier, always watching, always listening. The 2 sons were bigger than most men in the parish, thick in the shoulders, with a slow way of speaking that made others uneasy. Children said they saw the brothers watching from the trees when they played along the water's edge, and soon mothers forbade their little ones from wandering to Farron. Those years, crime in Louisiana often went unnoticed or unsolved. The bayou gave cover to bandits who preyed on travelers and smugglers who moved stolen goods through hidden channels. But when bodies began to appear in 1807, floating in the black waters or found face down among reeds, something felt different. These were not accidents, nor the work of desperate highwaymen. The victims were stripped of valuables and left in ways that suggested cruelty for cruelty's sake. Faces bore marks of beating, throats were cut too cleanly to be chance wounds, and in some cases, bones were broken, as if someone had taken time to inflict pain before death. The whispers grew louder in taverns and along church steps that the strange family deep in the swamp knew more than they ever said. The first known victim was a peddler, an old man who had wandered through the parish for years, selling needles, thread, knives, and trinkets to housewives. He was known by everyone, trusted by most. Yet one spring he vanished. Only weeks later, his pack was found tangled in roots near the family's land, the contents scattered into the mud like someone had emptied it in haste. The man himself was found days later, face down in shallow water, bloated by the swamp heat, his body marked by long gashes. No one saw who had done it, but suspicion turned toward the newcomers. Still without proof, no lawman dared to accuse Then a young couple traveling west disappeared. Their cart was found abandoned along the edge of the swamp, the horse tied to a way tree and left to starve. The bodies were not discovered until much later, and by then the swamp had done its work. Leaving little but bones stripped clean, the horror of it spread fast, and neighbors began locking doors at night, whispering of the family whose cabin lights burned late into the dark. The truth whispered by those who lived closest was that Jean and Marguerite and their sons had turned murder into trade. They watched the road that ran near the swamp, and when strangers passed through seeking a place to rest, they lured them in with offers of shelter. They promised food and water and safety from the snakes and the fevered air of the bayou. But once inside their home, the guests never left alive. They were robbed and their bodies dragged into the swamp where the waters swallowed them whole. The family kept the valuables and sold them. When they came into town, passing off rings and watches as their own, there were darker stories too, whispered in the half-light of churchyards. Some said they killed not only for profit, but for pleasure, they said. Screams echoed through the swamp. At night, that travelers bound for Natchez or New Orleans vanished, as if the earth itself had opened. Some believed the family practiced old rituals, strange gatherings lit by fire, where they mocked the prayers of the faithful and called on something darker to bless their killings. Whether those tales were truth or fear, no one could say, but the swamp gave them life. The bayou was a place where the line between real and imagined blurred, and where evil could grow in silence. By summer of 1807, the killings could no longer be ignored. Entire families vanished on their way westward. The stories reached the ears of officials in New Orleans. But law in those days traveled slowly, and the swamp had a way of protecting its own. Yet those who lived nearby knew where the evil came from. They saw the sons dragging sacks heavier than grain down toward the water. They saw Marguerite wearing a brooch that once belonged to a woman known to have disappeared. They heard Jean's heavy boots in the night pacing the edge of their land, as if guarding something more than a cabin. Fear became a constant companion. People stopped traveling the swamp road unless in large groups. Merchants took longer routes to avoid the waters. Children grew up believing the family was a curse, a punishment laid upon them for sins they had not named. The very air near their cabin seemed to grow colder, neighbors said, as if death itself clung to that place. What made it worse was that no one dared confront them. The family carried themselves with a boldness that came from knowing they would not be touched. Jean would stare down any man who dared question him, and his sons were strong enough to break bones with their hands. The law feared the swamp, and the swamp favored the family. It was as though they belonged to it, as though the bayou itself kept their secrets safe. But history has a way of unearthing darkness. No evil lasts forever, unseen, and by the end of that year, whispers would turn to shouts and suspicion into certainty. The killings had gone on too long, the trail of vanished souls too heavy to ignore, and soon men would gather determined to end the reign of the Forgotten Bayou Killers. Yet what they found when they finally dared to step onto that cursed patch of land would chill their blood for generations. The swamp seemed to hold its breath in those late months of 1807, as though the land itself knew something was building to a breaking point. Travelers had stopped along that cursed road, merchants avoided the region altogether, and still the family thrived, living off the silence of the missing their cabin. Lights burned through the night, shadows moved across the windows, and screams carried faintly over the black waters. Like the cry of a night bird, only the bravest dared to whisper the truth aloud, that the swamp hid a family of killers who hunted men like animals. Parish folk lived in a state of terror, but terror cannot last without breaking into rage. For every peddler who vanished, there was a widow. For every young couple who disappeared, there were parents who cried at church steps. For every missing child, there were brothers who sharpened knives in the dark. The people began to gather in whispers, first at the taverns, then in barns, then in the quiet corners of churchyards. They spoke of what must be done, and though no one wanted to say the words aloud, all knew the truth. The law was too far, the swamp too deep. If the evil was to be stopped, it must be stopped by the hands of ordinary men. But it was not easy to stir men. Against a family that seemed untouchable, the killers did not hide there. Strength the sons towered above most men, their shoulders broad as doors, their fists like mallets. They walked into town when they pleased and left with no questions asked. Jean carried himself with the silent threat of a man who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Marguerite was said to watch from the cabin door, with eyes so cold that even the bravest turned away. What weapon could pierce the hide of such a family? What fire could burn through the swamp and not be swallowed whole? Still the anger spread. Each missing neighbor, each body found half-eaten by the swamp's creatures, was fuel to the growing fire. The final spark came in the autumn when a flatboat crew headed toward New Orleans stopped near the swamp to camp for the night. They were never seen again. Days later, a skiff was found drifting downriver, carrying only blood-stained boards and scraps of clothing. One of the missing men had a brother in town, and that brother would not be silenced. He swore before God and man that he would see justice if it cost him his life. His cry roused others, and soon a small band began to form. They came with lanterns and muskets. With knives strapped to their belts and dogs at their heels, they were farmers and merchants, sons and fathers, men who had seen enough death. They met in war silence, their faces set hard by fear and determination. Some carried crosses around their necks. Some clutched rosaries, others carried nothing but hate in their hearts. Together, they stepped into the swamp, following the path toward the family's hidden ground. Air grew heavier with each step, the smell of rot and stagnant water pressing into their lungs. Cypress's knees rose from the water like bones reaching from shallow graves, and the cries of unseen creatures echoed through the dark. Yet the men pressed on, guided by the flicker of the lanterns and the memory of those who had vanished before them. The dogs sniffed the air, whining low, their ears flat against their skulls, as though they too sensed what waited ahead. When they reached the edge of the family's clearing, the sight froze them in their tracks. The cabin loomed in the half-light, its roof sagging under moss, its walls darkened with smoke. A fire burned outside, casting long shadows, and around it sat the family. Jean with his scarred face, the two massive sons sharpening blades, and Marguerite rocking slowly in a chair, as if awaiting them. The killers had not been caught by surprise. They had been waiting all along. Words were spoken at first, only the sound of crickets and the ripple of swamp water carried in the night. Then Jean rose to his feet, and the men saw the glint of a musket in his hand. His voice was low and steady when he spoke, telling them to leave before it was too late. He warned that the swamp belonged to his family, that the land had chosen them and would protect them until the end. He said those who crossed them would vanish like all the others and be forgotten beneath the black waters. But the men who had come were past fear. They raised their muskets and aimed at the cabin. The silence shattered with the crack of gunfire. Dogs barked, lanterns swung, steel clashed with steel. As the clearing exploded into violence, the family fought like cornered beasts. The sons charging into the crowd, their great fists smashing bones, Jean firing his musket and drawing a blade. When the powder ran dry, Marguerite screamed curses into the night, her voice shrill as she clawed at the faces of men who dared strike at her. The swamp lit with fire and fury. The men of the parish were brave, but they were unprepared for the ferocity of the killers. Blood stained the ground, cries of pain rose into the air. Some fell beneath the blows of the sons. Their skulls crushed their ribs. Shattered, others pressed forward, driven by rage and grief. One man drove a knife deep into the side of a son, only to be lifted and thrown into the fire. Another fired point-blank into Jean's chest, but the man staggered forward as if death itself hesitated to take him. It was Marguerite who seemed to drive them all. Her voice rose above the chaos, commanding her family as though she were not merely a wife or mother, but the dark heart of the evil itself. Her eyes gleamed with madness. Her hair? Wild in the firelight, she taunted the men, told them they would all join the bones already buried in the swamp, told them the land would drink their blood before the night was done. She seemed untouchable as she darted through the fight. Her hands stained with the blood of those who dared grasp her. The battle raged until the clearing itself looked like a butcher's yard. Lanterns were shattered, flames spread across the dry ground, and the swamp crackled with fire. Smoke rolled upward into the trees, and the cries of dying men echoed like lost souls. The killers fought without fear, and for a moment it seemed the swamp itself would claim victory, protecting its chosen family. But rage can make men unstoppable. One by one, the parish folk struck down their foes. A son fell to a musket ball through the heart, another to a blade across the throat. Jean at last crumpled to his knees, blood soaking his chest, his eyes still burning with hatred as he cursed those around him. Marguerite was the last to stand, her hands clawing her enemies, her screams rising into the dark. She fought until 3 men forced her down, pinned her arms, and ended her madness with cold steel. When it was done, the clearing fell silent. The fire flickered low, dogs whimpered, and men stood trembling, covered in blood and sweat. Some wept, some prayed, some stared blankly into the dark, unable to believe they were still alive. Around them lay the bodies of the family, broken and lifeless. At last, the swamp had lost its chosen children, and the land seemed to sigh, as though a great weight had lifted. But the victory brought no peace. The men looked around at their fallen brothers, the ground littered with the dead. The cost had been terrible, and though the killers were gone, the swamp still seemed alive with their presence. The air clung heavy, the water rippled without wind. Some swore they heard Marguerite's voice, still whispering through the trees, promising that death was not the end, that the family would rise again in the blood of others. The survivors dragged the bodies of the killers into the swamp, bound them with chains, and weighted them with stones. They cast them into the black water, where they sank without a sound, vanishing beneath the surface, as if the land welcomed them home. No graves were dug, no markers placed. The men swore they would never speak the family's name again. They called them cursed and vowed to let their memory rot with the swamp itself. Yet history has a way of clinging like moss to stone. Even when men try to bury the truth, whispers remain. The story of the Forgotten Bayou Killers spread in hushed voices across Louisiana, told at firesides and in taverns, passed down to children as warnings. Never travel the swamp road alone. Never trust the kindness of strangers. Never follow a light into the dark, for it may lead you to the same fate as those lost in 1807. The parish returned to silence, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of grief and of secrets kept. The land bore no markers to remember the dead. No papers recorded the battle, no preacher spoke of it from the pulpit. It was as though history itself chose to turn its eyes away, unwilling to carry the stain of such evil. And yet those who had seen the family knew that forgetting would never be possible. For every creak of the cypress, every ripple of black water, every cry of a night bird carried a reminder of the family too evil for the history books. The family who turned the swamp into a war hunting ground in the year 1807, into a tale that still chills the blood of those who dare remember. The swamp did not forget, though the men swore they would never speak the names again, though they cast the bodies into the black water and turned their backs upon the place. The land itself seemed to breathe with the memory of blood. The cypress trees that rose tall and silent seemed darker near the old clearing. The reeds whispered when no wind stirred, and travelers swore the bayou grew colder as they passed the place where the killers had lived. Even the animals avoided it. Dogs whined and pulled at their leashes, horses reared and refused to move forward. Birds fell silent when they flew across the cursed ground, as though the very earth carried the weight of what had happened. The men who had survived that night did not speak of it openly, but it lingered in them like a sickness. They bore scars upon their bodies, and worse still, upon their minds. Some woke screaming In the dark swearing, they heard Marguerite's voice whispering their names. Some saw the scarred face of Jean in the corners of their dreams. Some heard the thud of the son's fists, the crack of broken bones, the hiss of steel through flesh. They lived on, but part of them never left that clearing, never left the sight of the fire burning upon blood-soaked ground. They returned to their farms, their shops, their families, but neighbors could see they were changed. The butcher who once sang as he worked fell silent. The preacher who had stood tall in his sermons spoke in a voice that trembled. The farmer who had once been kind and gentle grew hard and sharp with his children, as though trying to strike the fear from his home. The evil had been destroyed in flesh, but not in spirit. It clung to them all, as though the swamp had breathed it into their lungs. And so the whispers grew. It was said that lanterns were seen moving among the trees, though no man walked there. It was said that cries of pain echoed faintly across the water, as though the battle replayed itself on nights when the moon was high. It was said that strange lights flickered in the cabin ruins, though the house had long since been left to rot. One man claimed he saw Marguerite herself standing on the ridge, her hair wild, her eyes burning, her hands reaching out as though begging to be dragged back into the world of the living. Another swore he heard the laughter of the sons deep in the seal and the trees, though no footsteps followed. Whether such tales were born of fear or truth, no one could say, but they spread like fire across the parish until at last the swamp itself became a place to be avoided. A road that once carried travelers westward fell into disused paths, overgrew with vines. Bridges rotted and collapsed. Families moved their homes farther inland, and even hunters refused to step foot too deep into the waters. They said the swamp had chosen its family, and though the flesh was gone, their spirits remained bound to the land. A curse as strong as blood itself. The new generation heard these tales from their elders. By firelight, children were told never to wander near the cypress grove, never to follow strange lights, never to answer voices in the dark, for it was believed the family still hunted, though not in flesh. Their spirits were said to lure the lost, the lonely, the careless, into the depths of the swamp, and those who vanished in later years, whether to gators or drowning or bandits, were often said to have been taken by the Forgotten Killers of 1807. What made the story so haunting was that there was never a written account. The officials in New Orleans never recorded the events. No trial was held, no record kept. The men who fought that night swore to keep their silence, to protect their parish from shame, and to prevent their children from not carrying the burden. Yet silence cannot hold back history. It leaks through memory, through whispers, through the shadows of a story that refuses to die, because people always ask when neighbors vanish, when bodies float in black water, when fear lingers on the edges of a place where no law dares walk. People ask what darkness lives here, and the answer returns like a voice carried by wind. It is the family too evil for the books, too cruel for the page, a story meant to be erased, yet forever remembered. In the land that drank their blood by the 1820s, the parish had changed. Louisiana was growing towns, spread fields, widened roads, improved. New Orleans bustled with ships and trade. Yet the swamp remained untouched, a vast wilderness guarding its secrets. Those who came new to the land sometimes heard the story from the old ones, laughed, and called it superstition. But when they wandered too far, when the water swallowed them whole, the laughter died on their lips, and the whispers grew stronger. The story of the Bayou Killers became not just a warning, but a kind of folklore, part of the very soil of Louisiana. It was not just death that kept the tale alive, it was the nature of the evil itself, for most killers strike in passion or greed. But the family seemed to kill with a coldness that defied reason. They turned murder into trade, yes, but also into something darker, into habit, into pleasure. It was said they mocked their victims, prayed false prayers as they cut them down, laughed as blood stained their cabin floor. That cruelty was what haunted people more than the bodies, more than the screams. It was the thought that human thoughts could grow so cold that a mother could lead her sons into murder, that a father could train his Hands not to build, but to kill that evil lived not in strangers, but in a family that broke bread together, that slept under one roof, that shared blood. The thought of it cut deeper than any blade, for America was still young, then still finding its footing, still building towns and laws and dreams of freedom, and the idea that such evil could root itself in a family in the heart of the new land filled people with dread. It was as though the promise of the nation itself had been poisoned by blood spilled in a swamp that no one wanted to name, and so the story lived not just as a memory of death, but as a shadow over the hope of a young country, a reminder that darkness follows men wherever they go, no matter how new the land, no matter how bright the dream. As the years passed, the names faded away. Only scraps of memory remained. The family became less flesh and more legend. Some said they were French cutthroats who fled the old world. Some claimed they were deserters from armies who turned to crime. Some swore they were never truly human at all, but spirits born of the swamp who took on flesh to feed and then returned to the water when their time was done. The truth was gone, lost in silence and in chains that dragged their bodies beneath the black, but the fear remained, and that was enough. Travelers in later decades sometimes claimed to find relics in the mud, a rusted blade, a brooch blackened by time, a button from a coat long dissolved by water. Each discovery sparked the whispers anew that the swamp had not released its dead, that the killers were still there waiting beneath the surface. And those who disappeared in the years to follow were always tied in memory back to 1807, back to the cursed clearing, back to the family no one dared to name. By the middle of the century, when America had grown and war once more tore at its seams, the story was told less often. Yet in the back corners of taverns and the lonely porches of farmhouses, the tale would rise. Again told by gray-haired men with voices low and eyes fixed on the dark beyond the lantern glow. They told it not for entertainment, but for warning. Because the swamp was still there, still deep, still silent, still dangerous, and men knew that some places never lose their evil, some places carry the weight of blood forever. So the Forgotten Bayou Killers remained half memory, half ghost-bound, not by paper, not by law, but by the fear of those who lived in the shadow of the swamp they were. The story fathers told their sons, the warning mothers whispered to daughters, the darkness that lurked in the heart of the land. They were not written in books, they were not carved on stones, yet they lived longer than any name carved in marble. They lived because fear has longer legs than memory, and the swamp never lets go of what it claims for. Those who walk the Louisiana waters, even now in the heat of summer, when the air is thick and the water black, when the cry of a Huron carries across the trees and the cypress knees rise like bones from the depths, they say you can feel it. A heaviness in the air, a silence that seems to watch. A reminder that once a family lived here, once evil thrived here, once blood soaked into the roots. And the land drank it deep, they say. If you listen close enough, you can still hear it, the faint sound of a musket, firing, the cry of a man as he falls, the laugh of a woman who killed without mercy. The swamp remembers, even when the books do not. The years turned to decades, and still the swamp carried its silence, its waters black and bottomless, its cypress trees rising like sentinels above the drowned earth. America marched forward, building cities, laying railroads, fighting wars, and yet the bayou remained unchanged, a world apart, untouched by progress, and stubbornly loyal to its stylus. And in that silence, the story of the Forgotten Bayou Killers endured, whispered from mouth to mouth, drifting like smoke across generations, never written, never taught, yet never lost. By the time the old men who had fought that night were buried, the tale had already grown into something larger than fact. Children no longer knew the faces or the names, only the shape of the horror they knew. There had been a family in the swamp, a family that killed with cruelty, and that the people of the parish had risen against them. They knew the land had swallowed the bodies, that no grave marked their passing. They knew the swamp had claimed them. Not as punishment, but as inheritance, as though the killers had been born of the black water and returned to it in death, and, though the story blurred with time, its power did not fade, for the bayou itself kept the memory alive. Travelers still vanished. Hunters still failed to return. Boats were found drifting empty with blood dried on their boards. The parish people shook their heads and heard that the killers had taken another, that the swamp had not been sated. They said the curse was never lifted because evil once rooted in the earth cannot be pulled up like a weed. It sinks too deep into the soil, into the water, into the very air, and so the land remained poisoned, haunted by the memory of blood. Visitors from the cities sometimes came, chasing stories of ghosts or treasure. They asked the locals to guide them to the place where the family had lived, to the clearing where the cabin once stood. But the locals refused. They said it was not a place for the living. They warned that even to speak too much of the family was to invite their notice, that the swamp still listened, and still remembered, and still waited for the foolish to wander into its grasp. Some laughed and went alone into the trees, and some of those were never seen. Again the story grew, until it was no longer just about a single family. It became a lesson told in many forms, a warning about greed, about cruelty, about the darkness that men carry in their hearts. Fathers told their sons that the swamp takes those who harm the innocent. Mothers told their daughters that the devil walks in the guise of family and can turn blood against blood. Preachers use the Ecclesiastes tale as proof that sin leads to damnation. Hunters told it as a reason to never travel alone at night, and children heard it as a bedtime story, one that sent them to sleep with eyes wide open, listening to every creak of the house, every cry of the night creatures outside their window. The swamp itself became almost a character in the tale, for people said it had chosen the family, had given them shelter and silence, had hidden their crimes, and then had swallowed them whole. They said the land itself was complicit in their evil, and that even after their deaths it carried their spirits. Some called it cursed ground, some said it was hell's doorstep, others whispered that the swamp was alive in ways men could not understand, and that the killers were its children. Returned to it when their work was done. What made the tales so powerful was the absence of paper proof. For in history books, the family never lived, they never killed, they never died. The year 1807 passed with mention of trade and politics, but no word of the swamp massacre, and so the story survived only in voice, in the hush of firelight, in the fear that slipped into men's eyes when strangers asked too many questions. It survived because it was too evil to be written, because no man wanted his name tied to such horror, because some truths are too heavy to bind in ink, and so the family became the kind of story that lives longer than any printed page, a story that feeds on fear, that grows in silence. Even into the late century and beyond, the story lingered. Travelers still avoided certain paths. Hunters still crossed themselves when they heard voices, and the Reeds families still kept lanterns burning through the night when storms rolled over the swamp, for fear that the killers might rise again and knock at their doors. In New Orleans, young men dared each other to walk into the bayou on moonless nights to see if they would hear the screams of the dead. In taverns along the Mississippi, boatmen told of cavey I'll play it, man told of strange lights flickering through the cypress trees, of faces glimpsed in the water of cave I'll play the kiwi and opir of ku of cave 8 atuehf they play each atu mhe delay live we is conley it's contus it's commerce my play f we play it play at they are real lies de blild bi khaled in a sige clay it condicared lie secret to me I lies stikitypic light I to by I stay I with at I bipicate to the got to put with it busted Voices calling their names in the dark. Always the voices were said to be cold. Always the faces twisted with hunger, and always the tale ended the same. Those who followed the voices never returned. The Forgotten Bayou Killers had become something larger than themselves. They had become the face of evil for a generation, the shape of fear for a nation still young. They stood as proof that darkness does not always come from distant wars or foreign lands, but can be born at home in the heart of a family. In the silence of the swamp, they were proof that the worst monsters wear the faces of fathers and mothers and sons, that blood ties can bind not only love but cruelty, and that the most dangerous home is not the stranger's, but one's own. And so the story carries weight even now, for when we look back at the early days of America, we see not only the bright dream of freedom and growth, but also the shadows that grew alongside it. We see not only the promise of a new land, but the darkness men brought with them, the sins they planted in its soil. The story of the Forgotten Bayou Killers reminds us that history is not only what is written, but what is whispered, what is feared, what is deliberately left out. For there are stories too terrible for the page, too shameful for the record, and yet those are often the truest of all. To this day, some who travel the Louisiana bayou swear they feel watched when they pass certain bends of water. They say the air grows heavy and still, that the trees seem to lean closer, that the silence presses on their chest. They say if you linger too long, you will hear it, the faint splash of something moving beneath the water, the crack of branches as though heavy footsteps follow you, the whisper of a woman's voice calling from the trees, and if you turn to follow that voice, you may never see daylight again. For the swamp does not forget, and neither do the killers, who sleep beneath its black surface, waiting always. So the tale endures, not written, not carved, not marked, but carried in the hearts of those who live in the shadow of the bayou. The Forgotten Bayou Killers remain nameless, yet unforgettable, faceless, yet forever feared. They are the family too evil for history books, the curse of 1807, the dark truth that America tried to bury, but the swamp refused to release. Their story belongs not to paper, but to water, to cypress, to silence. It belongs to the swamp, and as long as the swamp endures, so too will the memory of the evil that once called it home.